A transatlantic tempest, JD Vance's Munich bombshell. The Munich Security Conference is a yearly gathering of the world's most powerful figures. It is a forum for diplomacy and dialogue. However, this year the conference was shaken by a speech from an unexpected source. JD Vance, a junior senator from Ohio, took to the stage. His words sent shockwaves through the assembled dignitaries. Vance's speech was not a message of unity or reassurance. Instead, it was a scathing critique of Europe and its relationship with the United States. Vance's speech was notable for its bluntness. He did not mince words. His criticisms were direct and uncompromising. This departure from diplomatic norms immediately signaled a potential shift in American foreign policy. The senator's remarks, delivered with the full weight of his office, raised eyebrows and sparked heated debate. This was not simply a difference of opinion, it felt like a declaration. The transatlantic alliance, long considered a bedrock of the post-war order, seemed to tremble on its foundations. At the heart of Vance's speech was a simple yet profound message. Europe, in his view, had become too reliant on the United States. This dependence, he argued, had bred complacency and weakness. He pointed to Europe's anemic defense spending, its sluggish economic growth, and its perceived moral decay as evidence of this decline. Vance's words were a stark reminder of the shifting tides of global power. America, he seemed to suggest, was no longer willing to shoulder the burden of Europe's defense. The implications of Vance's speech were clear. The era of unquestioned American support for Europe was coming to an end. Whether this marked the beginning of a new, more transactional relationship, or a prelude to a complete transatlantic decoupling, remained to be seen. One thing was certain: the world was watching, and the stakes could not have been higher. The future of the West, and indeed the world, hung in the balance. The three pillars of Vance's critique: self-reliance, decay, and migration. Vance's speech, though delivered with the force of a thunderbolt, was not without its internal logic. He constructed his argument upon three central pillars, each carefully chosen to expose what he perceived as the flaws in the transatlantic partnership. The first, and perhaps most significant, was the call for European self-reliance in matters of defense. Vance argued, with increasing bluntness, that the United States could no longer be expected to act as Europe's de facto protector. Decades of underinvestment in their own militaries, coupled with a perceived over-reliance on the American security umbrella, had left European nations vulnerable, he argued. Vance pointed to the escalating tensions with Russia, the growing assertiveness of China, and the ever-present threat of terrorism as evidence that the world was becoming a more dangerous place. Europe, he argued, needed to wake up to this new reality and take responsibility for its own destiny. The second pillar of Vance's critique centered on his assessment of Europe's internal state. He painted a picture of a continent in the throes of a slow-burning crisis. He decried what he saw as the erosion of traditional values, the rise of identity politics, and a creeping authoritarianism that he believed was threatening the very fabric of European democracy. Vance pointed to the growing influence of populist movements, increasing restrictions on free speech, and a perceived unwillingness to confront radical Islam as evidence of this decline. Finally, Vance turned his attention to the issue of mass migration, an issue he framed as both a symptom and a cause of Europe's woes. He argued that uncontrolled immigration was overwhelming Europe's social welfare systems, fueling social unrest and undermining national identities. Vance's rhetoric on this issue was particularly pointed, tapping into a vein of anxiety and resentment that has been growing in many Western nations. Echoes of America First, a transatlantic divorce in the making. To many seasoned observers, Vance's speech carried with it the unmistakable echoes of a previous administration. The phrase "America First," once relegated to the fringes of American political discourse, seemed to find new life in the senator's words. Though never explicitly invoked, the spirit of Donald Trump's foreign policy, transactional, skeptical of alliances, and focused on narrow national interests, loomed large over Vance's pronouncements. This should not have come as a surprise. Vance, after all, was a self-proclaimed admirer of the former president, and his rise through the ranks of the Republican Party was seen by many as a sign of Trump's enduring influence. Yet, the question remained, was Vance simply channeling the ghost of American foreign policy past, or was he signaling a more permanent shift in the transatlantic relationship? The answer, as with most things in international relations, was complex and multifaceted. On the one hand, there was no denying that the ground had shifted beneath the transatlantic partnership in recent years. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis, and the rise of China had all taken their toll, leaving the United States weary of global commitments and increasingly focused on its own domestic challenges. On the other hand, it was also clear that the ties that bind Europe and the United States ran deep. Decades of shared history, values, and economic interests could not be easily undone. Moreover, the strategic logic of the transatlantic alliance, a united front against common adversaries, remained as compelling as ever. Section 4. Winners and Losers, the Shifting Sands of Global Power. Vance's speech, with its stark pronouncements and thinly veiled threats, laid bare the shifting sands of global power. It was a world where old alliances were being tested and new rivalries were emerging. In this fluid and uncertain environment, the question of who stood to gain from a weakened transatlantic relationship loomed large. The most obvious beneficiary, at least in the short term, was Russia. A divided and distracted West played perfectly into the hands of the Kremlin. With the United States preoccupied with domestic divisions and a rising China, and Europe left to fend for itself, Vladimir Putin would be free to reassert Russian influence in its near abroad. The Baltic states, long fearful of Russian revanchism, would be particularly vulnerable. China too stood to gain from a transatlantic rift. A weakened Europe would be less able to resist Chinese economic and political influence. Beijing, eager to expand its global footprint, would likely seize the opportunity to peel away European nations from the transatlantic orbit, offering them favorable trade deals and investment opportunities in exchange for political concessions. Perhaps the most surprising potential beneficiary of Vance's vision was the United States itself. At least, that was the argument put forward by some proponents of a more assertive American foreign policy. By shedding its commitments to Europe, the United States would free up resources to focus on the real prize, containing a rising China. Moreover, a weaker Europe would be more reliant on the United States for trade and security, giving Washington greater leverage in negotiations. Section 5. A European Reckoning Between Complacency and Crisis. Vance's Munich speech landed like a diplomatic hand grenade, leaving European leaders reeling in its wake. Accusations of complacency, decay, and strategic myopia stung, particularly coming from a country that had long been seen as Europe's closest ally. The speech forced a long-overdue reckoning in European capitals. Was Vance right? Had Europe become too comfortable under the American security umbrella, neglecting its own defenses and allowing internal divisions to fester? The initial reaction was a mixture of anger and disbelief. Many European officials dismissed Vance's words as the ramblings of an inexperienced ideologue, out of touch with the realities of European politics. Others, however, saw a grain of truth in his critique. Europe, they conceded, had indeed become overly reliant on the United States, both militarily and economically. The question was, what, if anything, could be done about it? The answer, as always, was complex. Europe, a patchwork of sovereign nations with diverse histories, cultures, and interests, was never going to speak with one voice on matters of foreign policy. Yet Vance's speech had exposed a fundamental vulnerability. Europe, for all its economic might and diplomatic clout, remained a geopolitical dwarf, dependent on the goodwill of others for its security. This realization sparked a debate that had long been simmering beneath the surface. Could Europe ever become a truly independent geopolitical actor, capable of defending its own interests and projecting its values on the world stage? Or was it destined to remain a collection of middle powers, forever caught between the United States and its rivals? The answer to that question, as Vance had made abundantly clear, would have profound implications for the future of Europe and the world.